When investigators entered apartment 3C in Pine Hollow, the air was heavy with the smell of mold and static. The calendar on the kitchen wall still showed March 1991, the month Daniel Rowe stopped showing up for work. Neighbors said his radio had played for weeks after he vanished. The same soft hum, no music, no words, just a single frequency that made the floor vibrate. On the dining table, a tape recorder sat beside an ashtray filled with melted wax, a cigarette burned down to the filter. The red light on the recorder was still blinking. When they pressed play, a voice filled the room, male, calm, mid-30s. Daniel's voice. He was asking a question, and then before he finished it, his own voice answered from somewhere else on the tape, slightly distorted, half a second too soon. The conversation overlapped, one version of him anticipating the other, like a dialogue between two moments that shouldn't exist together. The first tape ended with silence. The second began on its own. This time there was breathing, but no questions, no replies. Just the faint scrape of a chair moving across the floor. The creak of floorboards that didn't match the rhythm of the sound. One investigator thought it was playback interference. Another swore he heard his own name whispered from the background in a voice that matched his exactly. They stopped the recorder and sealed the tapes for analysis. But the sound continued, low, rhythmic, pulsing through the walls like the aftertaste of an echo that had nowhere to go. And that was the first sign that Pine Hollow wasn't just another missing person case. It was an answer, one that had spoken before the question was ever asked. The Pine Hollow Police Department logged the incident as Case 47A, filed under Domestic Disappearance Unresolved. Daniel Rowe, 34, was last seen leaving a grocery store 3 blocks from his apartment on March 12, 1991. No witnesses, no forced entry, no bank activity after that date. Only a string of noise complaints from neighbors in apartment 3B describing constant murmuring, conversations with no pauses, and voices overlapping like 2 radios out of sync. When authorities finally entered his residence, they found no signs of struggle. The power was still on. The clocks in every room showed different times, all frozen mid-minute, as if the electricity had cut at separate moments. A small collection of cassette tapes sat stacked beside the recorder, each labeled in Daniel's handwriting: Echo Test 1, Echo Test 2, Response Study, Unknown Playback. The dates were inconsistent, some marked before his disappearance, others weeks after. The tapes were transferred to the local evidence lab, then later sent to the Acoustic Research Division of the State Bureau, where the anomalies deepened. Analysts discovered no signs of editing or splicing, but each recording contained 2 identical frequencies overlapping, one slightly ahead of the other by fractions of a second. It wasn't an echo. It was prediction. Official reports note that by the time the recordings reached the Bureau, 2 technicians had refused to handle them again. Both claimed to have heard their own voices on playback, speaking phrases they had never recorded. From that point on, the tapes were sealed under the designation, the Pine Hollow Anomaly. They were never released to the public, not because of what they contained, but because of what they seemed to know. The door to apartment 3C opened with the soft pop of paint separating from paint. The building manager stood back while the officers stepped in, letting the stale hallway air fold into the room. No rush of smell, no sudden heat. Just a mild, metallic coolness, like the inside of an unplugged refrigerator. The entryway led directly to a narrow kitchen. On the counter, a single ceramic mug, ringed brown, a spoon cemented in place by a line of sugar fused to the saucer. The calendar above the phone still read March 1991, a square red X over the 12th. The phone's coiled cord hung like a stopped pendulum, the receiver cradled perfectly, as if it had never been lifted. The first report notes that the apartment was orderly, precise, drawers shut fully, chairs pushed in, shoes aligned toe to heel by the front mat. A thin film of dust lay evenly over everything except for 3 places: the round table, the tape recorder, and the carpet strip between the kitchen and living room. There, the nap of the fiber showed a slight flattened lane, as if a path had been walked again and again, heel never quite rising, toe never quite pressing down. The officer's own footprints left clearer shapes in the dust near the balcony door, but there were none leading to it from within. Outside the glass, Pine Hollow's backlot was a skein of winter-thin maple branches, gray as pencil shavings against the dusk. The living room was quiet in a way that suggested sound had recently been there and then gone out for air. 2 bookcases, one short and cheap and bowed near the middle, held a precise order of cassettes, mostly blank Maxell and TDK spines, with Daniel Rowe's handwriting in block letters: Test A, Test B, Echo 3, Response 5. Between the shelves, a square TV on a metal stand faced a couch that seemed never to have been sat on. Its cushions still held the straight seam marks of manufacture. On the far wall, a framed print of a lake at evening hung perfectly level. The lake wasn't named in the caption. It was simply called Evening Water. They logged the tape recorder last, though it was the first thing they'd noticed. It sat on the table with the casual gravity of an object that had been used so often it had achieved the status of furniture. The REC light was off. The counter window showed 000. Either it had been rewound or it had never been allowed to run to its own end. The mic jack host sat empty, but a small lapel microphone lay coiled beside it, clean, untangled, the clip polished by nervous fingers. One of the officers pressed stop out of habit and heard the soft mechanical refusal of a machine that was already stopped. He pressed play and was told, equally softly, that play could not begin without a tape. They catalogued the tapes by label first, and by weight when the labels became unhelpful. Some cassettes felt fractionally heavier, an illusion, the report notes, created by hand temperature and expectation. Others were still in cellophane, the heat-shrunk plastic smooth and reflective, skin-like. The officers opened none of them at that time. They photographed the spines. They photographed the table and the recorder and the balcony glass and the shoes at the door. They took an ambient temperature reading in each room: 61 in the kitchen, 59 in the living room, 63 in the bedroom. The thermostat was set to 68. The heating unit was on. The vents were cool. The bedroom held little. A neatly made bed, a nightstand with a small lamp, and a book about shortwave frequencies marked by a train ticket used as a bookmark. The ticket wasn't from Pine Hollow. It was from a line that hadn't served the county since 1978. In the closet, shirts hung in color order, the sleeves facing the same direction. On the top shelf, a shoebox full of batteries, all neatly arranged positive end out. In the bottom drawer of the dresser, beneath folded undershirts, a notebook. They opened it only far enough to see the first page. Echo doesn't wait. The rest of the writing was a neat, forced hand. They did not read further then. The bathroom mirror had been wiped clean with something that left no streaks, and yet the glass still seemed to carry a film. The officer who checked it held his breath and leaned in, expecting to see the constellation of old scratches and ghosted toothpaste flecks that every bathroom mirror bears. He saw none. The mirror reflected with an almost disagreeably fresh accuracy, no room for haze, no room for old light. When he stepped away, the mirror kept the sense of someone still standing there, as if the crispness of the reflection had a half-life of its own. They recorded the ambient noise of the apartment on a fresh cassette as a matter of procedure. For the first 30 seconds, the standard breath of building pipes, a distant elevator chain, the occasional click in the walls where heat met cold. Then, when the officer announced the case number for the record, a second version of the number sounded faintly, half a beat before his voice said it. Not an echo, too early for that. Not interference, too precisely matched. It startled no one at first. The mind files such things under coincidence until there are enough to require a new folder. They sat at the table finally, as if called to it by a meeting that had always been scheduled. One officer held the recorder. The other stood, arms folded. The manager hovered at the door, apologetic about the peeling paint and the old windows and the radiator that clanked in winter, none of which were clanking now. They selected Test A because it seemed the most likely to disappoint. The tape rolled. A voice introduced itself as Daniel, without last name. The voice said the date plainly, March 10, and the hour. And then the hour again in a whisper that arrived a fraction of a second before the voice that had said it. The next minute of the recording was uneventful. The voice cleared its throat. The voice asked an obvious question, the kind one asks equipment to check if it is listening. And then the tape answered, not after, not in response, but immediately before the question finished, as if the end of the sentence had already been placed in the air and the tape had simply chosen to let it out a fraction early. The difference was small enough to be arguable and large enough that no one wanted to argue. The officer holding the recorder rewound 6 seconds and played it again and again until repetition did what it always does, turned the unsettling into the almost normal. They wrote offset present and measured with a pen tip the distance between the two versions of the same word. By the time they stopped the tape, the light through the balcony door had thinned to that color that isn't gray so much as the idea of gray. They logged the cassettes in boxes, the recorder in another, the notebook in a sealed envelope, the batteries in a separate bag because that was procedure. The apartment made no protest. The print of the lake on the wall held its evening as if evening were a position and not a time. The officers thanked the manager, who locked the door and tugged it once to make sure. The hallway carpet gave beneath their shoes as if absorbing not weight but noise. When the building settled, a sound like furniture remembering it was furniture, it happened half a second earlier than the officers recalled it happening. The report for that day ends with a sentence that reads, in full, no sign of forced entry or struggle, signs of use without motion. In the margin, a line added later in a different pen, faint but tangible. Note, Small predictive offset on audio. Retest with new machine. Beneath that, a second note, added later still, in the same hand but a slower pressure. Offset present regardless of device. They closed the file for the night. Outside, the maples in the back lot stood in a kind of motion that trees sometimes achieve in still air, a suggestion of movement rather than movement itself, like a sound that has decided to arrive before it's made. The tapes were delivered to the lab 2 days later. The facility was small, one of those rented rooms inside the county courthouse basement that smelled of old paper and disinfectant. 2 desks, a reel-to-reel setup, and a wall calendar still showing February. The audio technician, Mara Ellison, signed the intake log with a blue pen that skipped on the paper. She was new to the department, had transferred from Chicago after a burnout case involving intercepted calls and misfiled frequencies. She didn't believe in the supernatural. She believed in timing errors, magnetic interference, and the human need to make ghosts out of static. She started with the first cassette, Test A. The reel moved smoothly, no tape damage, no splicing. On playback, Daniel's voice emerged clearly, monotone, methodical. He was counting seconds aloud, measuring delay response. There was nothing unusual until the 5th count, when a faint version of his own voice whispered the number 5 a split second before he did. Mara noted it as minor lag artifact, possible pre-echo. She played it again. The whisper stayed ahead of the voice, unwavering in its precision. When she reversed the tape, there was no corresponding imprint. The pre-echo wasn't recorded in reverse. It wasn't an echo at all. She logged it as Anomaly 1, Predictive Overlap, then moved on to Test B. Daniel's tone had changed, more deliberate, as though he were aware something was listening. He repeated simple questions into the mic. Is there anyone else here? And immediately, his own voice, same timbre, same inflection, answered, yes. There was no splice, no second track, no frequency mismatch. The voice had spoken before the waveform of the question had even peaked. Her hand froze above the desk. She played it again. By the 3rd playback, she started feeling watched. The small lab had no windows, yet her reflection moved faintly in the dark surface of the tape deck, delayed by half a breath. Her headset began to hum with a low resonance, the kind that doesn't exist outside the skull. When she adjusted the volume, the hum adjusted back, like a sound calibrating to her own pulse. She stopped the machine. The room fell silent, except for a single click from nowhere in particular, like a pen being uncapped. She checked the timestamp on her recording log. It read 14:23. The clock on the wall said 14:24. The computer's internal clock said 14:22. None of them moved after that. Mara pressed record on a blank tape and spoke the time aloud. When she played it back, her voice came before the timestamp, exactly 1 second before. She labeled it Control Recording A, Mirror Offset Self, then sealed all tapes for review. That night, the security guard on duty reported hearing conversation coming from the basement lab long after she left. 2 voices, one asking questions, the other answering, always too soon. By Thursday, the Pine Hollow precinct had turned the case over to state investigators. The official reason was resource allocation. The unofficial one was unease. Officers had begun refusing to catalog the audio evidence alone. They said the tapes anticipated movement, that the reels started spinning a fraction of a second before anyone pressed play. Mara Ellison didn't report that detail in her notes. She had already been marked as too sensitive in her previous department, and Pine Hollow wasn't kind to new names. Instead, she brought her own equipment from home, a compact Usher deck and a frequency analyzer. She wanted to prove it was a feedback illusion, something measurable. Science was structure. She just needed more data. She began logging waveform patterns by speaking simple phrases into a test mic. Her plan was to compare them with the old tapes from Daniel Rowe's apartment. On the fifth recording, while saying the words, "Test begins now," the analyzer captured a second input, identical to her voice, but ahead by 1.4 seconds. It wasn't distortion. It had full harmonic depth, like a real voice overlapping time. Mara deleted the file immediately, but when she restarted the system, it reappeared in the directory, dated March 12, 1991, 6:11 p.m., the last date Daniel had been seen. That night, she called the apartment manager to ask if any neighbors had ever complained about noise. He said there hadn't been any, then paused. Actually, there had been something. A man upstairs who'd moved out last year said the sound of someone finishing his sentences kept him awake. Mara asked if he remembered the man's name. The manager said no, but he remembered the man's laugh. And then he said something odd. "I still hear it sometimes, when I'm locking up. Always half a second before I do." She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her motel room staring at the portable tape deck on the dresser. The air conditioner ticked in uneven intervals, offbeat, unpredictable, like an object forgetting its rhythm. She began to wonder what rhythm was, really, if it was the same everywhere or just an agreement between perception and memory. By morning, she'd made a decision. A controlled test with multiple observers. If she could replicate Daniel's anomaly in front of witnesses, the case would move from speculation to data. She called 2 colleagues from the forensic audio unit. Both agreed reluctantly. They met in the lab that afternoon under fluorescent light that hummed in the register of fatigue. They set up a single microphone and 3 separate recorders running in sync. Each of them would ask a different question, simple, factual, with verifiable answers. Mara went first. "What day is it today?" The question played back instantly, followed by the faint sound of her own voice saying "Wednesday" before the original question finished. Her colleagues stared at her as the second recorder played the same anomaly. The third device, still running, began recording on its own. No one had pressed the button. The second investigator, nervous, asked, "Who are we talking to?" The voice that answered was not any of theirs. It was flat, polite, patient. "You already know." They shut everything down. One of the recorders began to rewind itself, spooling tape backward with a sound like breathing through water. On playback, the reversal made no difference. The answer still came before the question. The official report was brief. Unverified equipment malfunction during standard audio testing. Further analysis required. Mara's private notes told another story. She wrote that she felt time itself wrinkle, not bend, not stop, but prepare to move, the same way you draw a breath before speaking. Before she left the lab that night, she labeled a new folder, Rowe Anomaly, Voice Predictive Loop, Stage 2, and beneath it, in smaller handwriting, if it answers before we ask who was doing the asking. It was raining when Mara returned to the lab. The kind of steady, metallic rain that made the gutters hum and the parking lot shimmer like liquid glass. She liked that sound. Rain was a system, predictable, measured. But that night, the drops seemed uneven, as if falling slightly out of sync with themselves. Each impact on the roof came half a second too soon, like a metronome counting ahead of the beat. Inside, the lab smelled of coal dust and ozone. The 3 recorders from the previous test were still sealed in evidence bags, tagged and dated. No one had touched them since. Still, one of the reels was turning when she walked in, slowly. No power, no sound, just motion, a lazy clockwise rotation, like an object remembering what it used to do. Mara unsealed it. The label read, Control 3, Session March 14. She hit stop. It didn't. She unplugged the cable. It kept turning for 6 full seconds before winding down. When she replayed the tape, there was nothing but room tone until her own voice whispered, "Don't pull the plug yet." She froze. It wasn't playback lag. The sentence came before the click of her unplugging the cord. That meant the tape had recorded an event that hadn't happened yet, and it had done it perfectly. Breath, inflection, the slight tremor in her voice. She set her notes down and pressed rewind. Halfway through, the machine stopped itself. The counter read 00007, a full minute shorter than the total runtime. She noted it. Temporal skip, 60-second differential. The next morning, she brought in 2 witnesses, a physicist from the local university and a technician from evidence control. Both had signed confidentiality forms. They set up a new series of recorders, digital and analog, all powered through isolated circuits. The idea was to see if the anomaly followed format or equipment. At precisely 3 p.m., Mara spoke into the mic. "This is Control B, beginning baseline test." The physicist logged the exact time. 3 seconds later, all 4 recorders clicked on, unprompted. Not simultaneously, but one after another, forming a pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4. And in that staggered rhythm, her voice repeated the same line, perfectly synced, but always slightly earlier on each device. By the final unit, she hadn't even started speaking, yet her voice was already there, announcing the baseline test that hadn't begun. The physicist turned white. He said softly, "You're not ahead of it anymore, Mara. It's ahead of you." That night, she played the recordings back at half speed. Slowed down, the pre-voices carried subtle differences, tiny variations in tone that didn't belong to her. It was as if something was using her cadence but learning how to refine it, mimicking, anticipating. At 9:03 p.m., the building lights dimmed. A transformer outside groaned under the weight of sudden power draw, though no machines were on. The rain had stopped. Mara checked the hallway. Empty. She returned to her desk, started typing her report. Each keystroke felt slightly delayed, as if the keys were resisting her timing. Then she saw it. Her monitor cursor blinking half a second ahead of her input. Letters appeared before she pressed the keys. At first, it was gibberish. Then, it wasn't. It spelled, "Stop asking." She pulled the plug on the computer. The words stayed on the dark screen, red and faint, like they'd been burned into the glass. The clock on the wall froze at 9:03, the same time stamped on the power logs later retrieved from the substation. When she finally left the lab, the rain had started again, but now it was perfectly in rhythm. Every drop hit exactly when expected. And that, she thought, was worse. The weekend passed without sleep. Mara tried, but her body had forgotten how to close its eyes completely. She would drift halfway into rest, only to wake to sounds that didn't belong to night. Not cars or pipes, but phrases. Half words muttered at the edge of hearing. Sometimes she thought she recognized her own voice among them, half whispering from a corner that wasn't there. By Sunday, she stopped trying to rest and went back to the lab. Better the hum of equipment than the whisper of silence. The first thing she noticed was the clock. The wall clock's second hand no longer jumped forward in ticks. It glided now, smooth and continuous, as though time had liquefied. Beneath it, the date calendar still read March 15, 1991. She flipped it to the 16th and felt a strange static under her fingertips. A fine vibration, like holding the throat of someone about to speak. She decided to try a new approach. No playback, just record. She set the tape running and left the room for exactly 5 minutes, locking the door behind her. When she returned, the reels had stopped early, midway through the tape. She pressed rewind. The counter flickered. The audio began with silence, and then the sound of footsteps. Her own. But she hadn't entered the room. She kept listening. The chair moved, the microphone stand adjusted, and then her voice spoke softly. "You're late." Her pulse hammered. She checked the hallway security feed. No entry, no motion. The lab had been still. Yet there she was, on tape, performing a sequence she had never lived. She wrote in her notebook, echo preceding physical event, possible memory contamination. At noon, her supervisor called. He said the division had reviewed her reports and wanted the case transferred. Too many discrepancies, too much time unaccounted for in her log sheets. He sounded nervous, more so when she asked him if he'd listened to the tapes. He said no, and then stopped mid-sentence. The line filled with a faint duplication of his own voice, repeating his words a fraction ahead of him. He hung up. A minute later, the phone rang again. It was her voice this time, saying, "He's right. You should stop." Mara unplugged the phone and smashed the receiver against the counter. The plastic cracked but didn't break completely. Inside, a low humming tone continued, uninterrupted. She left it there and turned all her focus to the recorders. If the phenomenon was repeating her, maybe it could be trapped by removing herself from the process. She placed a fresh cassette into the deck, pressed record, and sat perfectly still. For 1 full minute she didn't move, breathe, or think a word. The reel turned. When she played it back, she heard the room's silence, clean and featureless, for about 10 seconds. Then came the click of a lighter. Her lighter, from her coat pocket across the room. Then her voice. It's learning how to pause. And then, unmistakably, another voice whispered just beneath it, a second, quieter version of herself, asking, what happens when it stops? The reel ended there, but the air didn't feel finished. There was a physical weight now, a dense stillness that pressed against her ribs. Even her breathing felt late, as if the oxygen around her had already been used. She picked up her pen to document it and noticed her handwriting forming before her hand moved. Each letter appeared half a second early. Her body was no longer in charge of its own sequence. Outside, the power grid flickered across Pine Hollow. For 11 seconds, every clock in the town stopped. At exactly the 12th, they all resumed, but each displayed a slightly different time. No two matched. And one, the lab clock above Mara's desk, began ticking backward. When she played the last tape again later that evening, it had changed. The final line wasn't "what happens when it stops" anymore. It now said, clear and unbroken, "It already has." By Monday morning, Mara couldn't tell when she'd last left the lab. She checked the visitor log. Her name was written 6 times, all in the same handwriting, each entry marked with different dates that hadn't come yet. She tore the sheet off the clipboard and stuffed it into her pocket. It was raining again, harder this time, but she couldn't hear the drops anymore, only the echo of them, arriving just before they hit the roof. The division sent an agent to retrieve the evidence, Agent F. Colburn, Bureau of Investigative Sciences. He looked exhausted, or maybe already sick of whatever he'd read in her reports. When she shook his hand, he winced. "Static," he said. She didn't correct him. There was no static. The air itself hummed, faint and steady, like a far-off generator idling under the floor. They began the transfer audit at noon. All equipment had to be sealed before transport. Mara showed him the logbooks, the tapes, the notebooks. He took photos, checked serials. Then, before signing, he asked if he could hear one of the echo samples. She hesitated, then loaded Test B into the deck. The machine spun. Daniel Rowe's voice emerged, calm, procedural, measuring intervals. Colburn frowned. He'd heard weirder. Then Daniel's voice said, "Who's the new one?" The question came exactly as Colburn drew breath to speak. He froze mid-inhale. The words had arrived before him. The tape stopped on its own. The reels kept turning. Colburn exhaled slowly, forced a laugh. "Cute trick," he said, writing something in his notes. I noticed his pen scratching faintly before he moved his hand, each stroke already there. He didn't notice, or pretended not to.
After he left, the lab felt different. Not quieter, more occupied. Every flat surface seemed to hold a breath, waiting. Mara turned off the overhead lights and sat in the glow of the recorder. She played another tape, one of her own, labeled Control Recording A, Self. It began normally, her voice giving timestamps. Then, at minute 3, another voice entered. Her tone, her words, but they weren't hers. It said, "You can stop proving it now. We believe you." She stopped the playback, checked the tape length, identical to the original log. No added splices, no edits. The voice had always been there. She simply hadn't noticed before. She rewound it, hit play again, and this time the voice added something new. "It's your turn to listen." The room temperature dropped 2 degrees. She could see her breath fog in front of her, faint but visible. The fluorescent lights along the hallway flickered, one after another, in a wave that rolled toward her. The hum grew deeper, slower, until it wasn't a hum anymore, but a pulse. She pressed her palms against the desk to steady herself. The pulse matched her heartbeat, then overtook it. The difference was subtle, but she could feel it. Her heart was now responding to the sound, not leading it.
The recorder clicked. No one touched it. The reels started spinning backward. Through the speakers came a single whisper, stretched thin like magnetic tape under strain. "We were waiting for you." She stood up so fast the chair toppled. The whisper came again, louder, layered. Dozens of her own voices overlapping, all speaking slightly ahead of one another. Each one said a different version of the same phrase. "We were waiting. We've been waiting. We will wait." She reached for the power cord, but her fingers passed straight through the switch, as if the air between her and the outlet had solidified into glass. She yanked harder, stumbled back, breath ragged. The recorder's reels blurred to silver. The room filled with sound, every word she'd ever spoken in that lab, playing all at once. Then it stopped. The silence afterward wasn't absence. It was shape. She could feel it move, not through her ears, but behind them. A stillness with edges. A silence that leaned toward her. On her desk, her notebook opened by itself. The page was blank. Then, in her own handwriting, letters began to form. "Ask the question." Her throat burned. "I don't know what to ask," she whispered, but the silence answered before she finished. "Yes, you do." For the next 48 hours, no one saw Mara Ellison. Her car stayed parked outside the courthouse annex, wipers frozen mid-arc, streaked with dried rain. The lights in the basement lab remained on. From the street, passers-by said they heard faint murmuring through the ventilation ducts, a voice speaking in even intervals, punctuated by short bursts of static that sounded almost like breathing. When the building custodian unlocked the lab on Wednesday morning, the air hit him like a pressure wave, not cold, not warm, but dense. Every piece of metal hummed softly, the fluorescent bulbs overhead throbbing at irregular rhythms. He called for backup. By the time the first officer arrived, the hum had faded and the room was still, perfectly arranged. No sign of struggle, no chaos. Only the recorder, sitting in the center of the desk, its reels still turning though the machine was unplugged. The desk log was open. The last entry, written in Mara's handwriting, read, "They've stopped waiting." Beneath it, a second line, the same words but shakier, misaligned. "They've stopped waiting." Then a third, written over itself again and again until the ink tore through the page. An evidence tech, wearing gloves, stopped the recorder by pressing gently on the reel. It slowed without protest. He turned it over and found a fresh cassette inside, unmarked except for a faint line etched into the plastic shell. Not a label, but a groove that looked like someone had traced a circle there over and over. He hit play. No voice. No hum. Only room tone, the quiet of the lab itself. Then, faintly, under the static, a knock. 3 slow taps, the exact pattern of someone typing on a keyboard. And then, her voice. "If you're hearing this, it's already listening to you." The tech recoiled, hit stop. He opened the cassette. Inside, the magnetic tape was blank, factory new, no oxide wear, no imprint. Yet when he replayed it, the voice was still there, and this time it spoke differently. Don't rewind, it remembers. The tape was sealed and transferred to state storage within the hour. But in the recording room, where the machine had stood, an unusual residue was found on the table surface, a fine grayish dust arranged in circular patterns that matched the spinning of the reels. Microscopic analysis later showed that the residue contained no organic material, no known polymer. It wasn't dust. It wasn't residue. It was ferric oxide, the same compound used to record magnetic sound, only it had crystallized into matter. Later that night, when the chief reviewed the evidence log, he noticed something wrong with the timestamps. Every entry recorded afternoon that day was preceded by a faint duplicate of itself, the same line 1 second earlier, as though the system had already written what was about to be typed. The IT team blamed a sync glitch, but when they tried to print the logs, the text on the paper came out doubled, overlapping, each word shadowed by the same word again, slightly ahead, slightly misaligned. It looked less like printing error and more like two moments in time arguing over who got to exist first. At 3:07 a.m., the night watchman reported hearing a voice from the evidence vault. He said it sounded calm, tired, female. She was reciting a report number. The number matched the Pine Hollow case file. He unlocked the door. The lights inside flickered on, one by one. The vault was empty, except for a single tape recorder on the floor, its reels turning. No tape inside, just the mechanism spinning, endless, steady. He bent to look closer. The reel slowed, stopped, and then, faintly through the metal housing, he heard it breathe. In the days that followed, Pine Hollow's municipal clocks began losing time. Not randomly, uniformly, 1 second per day, as if counting backward from something only they understood. At the town library, old microfilm readers began activating themselves, spooling frames of silent images that no one remembered archiving. On every screen, a woman sat in a small room, her reflection watching her from the glass of a recorder. No one could identify her with certainty. The footage carried no sound, only a faint vibration when played, a low, rhythmic hum that, when amplified, formed the shape of a voice saying, "We're still listening." The Pine Hollow anomaly file was officially closed in 1992. Its contents remain sealed under federal classification, but audio technicians still speak of it in half-jokes and lowered tones, because every few years, somewhere in the country, a recorder starts up on its own, and the first thing it captures isn't a sound at all. It's a silence too perfect to be empty, a silence that waits for someone to ask the question first. There's a rumor that circulates in audio restoration circles, whispered between engineers who've handled too many forgotten archives. They say there's a particular hiss that doesn't belong to any frequency, a sound that isn't a sound. You'll know it when you hear it, because the meters on your console won't move, yet something in the room will. In 2003, a warehouse clerk in Oregon found a box mislabeled "Property of Stillwater County." Inside were several reels of unmarked tape, the oldest flaking with rust-colored dust. He played one. For exactly 7 minutes, there was nothing. Then, faintly, his own voice spoke, describing the sound of the tape he was listening to in perfect synchronicity. He stopped the player. The voice kept talking for another 5 seconds. Experts said it was impossible. Bleed-through, re-recording, suggestion. But technicians who listened to the copy later reported feeling a pressure in their jaw, like being underwater. One described it as the silence of something that's still deciding what to be. None of them finished the playback. The reel was later confiscated by the Bureau of Investigative Sciences and sealed along with the Pine Hollow evidence. Every decade, a new team is assigned to digitize the files. Every decade, they return the boxes unaltered, the data drives empty. Because when they play the tapes, the computers freeze. Not crash, freeze, mid-second, as if time itself were holding its breath. And the only line ever recovered from any of those sessions is the same, etched faintly into the machine's buffer logs. Don't ask the question. But the question keeps finding its way back. In university sound labs, in local radio interference, in home recordings that pick up whispers half a beat before they're spoken. The voice has no language, but it understands timing. It always answers first. If you listen closely, not to the noise, but to the gap before it, you might hear it waiting. And if you ever find an old tape that hums when it's not spinning, don't rewind it. Don't play it. Just leave it where it is. Because some echoes don't follow sound. They remember the space before sound was possible. And when the wind stops, it doesn't die. It only listens.
Subscribe for the next story and tell us what you think the tape was waiting for. We're still listening.